This week in my design history class, I had an assignment where I was going to make a poster for an animated short using the same style as Victorian era advertisements. However, it wasn't the end piece of the poster that's sticking with me the most, but rather a photo I used as part of the end result. Now, this assignment initially proved to be a challenge, but compared to the other options I had, this seems like probably the best way to go. Here's an example of an 1882 advertisement for, of all things, an inhaler, which is ironic because I am severely asthmatic and I actually just had to use an inhaler before making this recording. Bright, vivid colors were, from what I've been able to find, saved for the tail end of the Victorian era, going into the Edwardian era. However, I could only go up to 1900, so I thought that early to middle advertisement styles were probably the best way to go. I am extremely slow with digital painting and coloring, and the color gamut on my laptop screen isn't the greatest, so I knew my best bet was to stick with something more monochromatic. While I did my research for this assignment, I found about a dozen examples of Victorian era advertisements, and then went on Wikimedia Commons to find period photos. I got up to 1865 before I overall decided that I had plenty. I love the photos I managed to collect, and I began experimenting on Photoshop with a few of them. One early rendition of the poster saw me take this photo, titled Zenaida Yusupova at the Age of 5. I essentially cropped the photo until it was just her portrait, rather than the majority of the space being taken up by the black background. I duplicated the layer 48 times, and then took each layer individually and used Photoshop's Trace Contour tool, increasing the level by increments of 5 each time. Then I set the layer to multiply. Then I set a pencil sketch filter over the final merged photograph. While I know how to do batch commands, I wasn't sure how to make Photoshop increase the increments that the level should be at, or even if I could do that, so I did this individually, one by one. It was a very tedious process. I loved how it turned out. Watching the end result emerge was very fascinating for me. However, the end result felt too Alice in Wonderland for my taste. Which is fun! I love Alice in Wonderland, but the animated short this was for was essentially based on a concept I've been sitting on for years, and Alice in Wonderland doesn't fit the aesthetics. So I decided to start a new file and start again. As I went through my little library of Victorian photography, there was one photo in particular that stood out to me by far the most. And that was this photo taken in 1865 by a British photographer named Julia Margaret Cameron, called The Return After 3 Days, which depicts a child surrounded by 3 women with flowers in front of them. This photo was very unique compared to the stiff, almost formulaic portrait photos that otherwise came from that period, and I love it. Now, because of the piercing gaze of the little girl, and because of the time period this photo was taken in, I stopped to consider it for a moment, and then I wondered, is this child dead? Because that's something the Victorians used to do, was take photos of the dead, because that was oftentimes the only time they'd ever get their photos taken, because photography was still new and relatively expensive at the time. I had the name of the photo in German, and I had the name of the woman who took the photo, which was another thing that stood out to me, because all the other credited photographers of all the other photographs were men. So I took to Google to see what I could find out about the history, and what I found surprised me. First off, I found the names of the women in the original photo, including the little girl. Mary Kellaway, Mary Hillier, Mary Ryan, and the little girl's name was Freddie Gold. I wasn't able to find much information about these people except that Mary Hillier was Julia's housemaid. But what I did find, according to the Victoria and Albert Museum located in South Kensington, was that Julia was known to take unconventional photographs. She was a devout Christian and oftentimes had religious symbolism in some regards in her photographs. I wasn't ever able to find out the age of the older girls in the photo, but I did find out that Cameron often didn't photograph adult women, so they're likely to be teenagers in this photo. Title of the photo, The Return After 3 Days, is in reference to Luke 2:41-51. This is what Luke 2:41 through 51 reads, if you'd like to pause and read it. Now, when I saw that this was the Bible story the museum attached to this photo, I thought that it was interesting, considering this doesn't exactly conjure up the image of a preteen Jesus sitting in a temple in Jerusalem. One thing that the museum notes on its website is that Julia's photography was thought to be mostly metaphorical. Now, I feel morally obligated to inform you that the main character of this animated short that I've been writing is not a Messiah-type character. But an interesting thing I noticed was a similarity between the plot of this specific short and this particular Bible story. In this animated short, a young woman goes missing, and it takes forever to find her. A lot longer than 4 days. When they do finally find her, however, they find her in an unusual situation in an unusual place. And she can't exactly tell them why or how she ended up there. With that being said, I know that while my art style is not photorealistic at all, this photo is perfect as a period piece that I can incorporate into something that I've been working on all these years later after the original photo was taken. I replicated the same process as I did with the last photo, but instead of using trace contour in increments of 5, I only did increments of 20, and after playing around with it a bit, I ended up with this. I didn't intend for the girl to end up with black eyes, but considering the circumstances in the short, it works out pretty well. Everything seemed to line up once I found the final photograph that I decided to go with. And while it doesn't have the ornate stylism or the colors that I would have liked to replicate, I'm overall pretty happy with how I found it. As a matter of fact, when I was finding the final image, I wasn't able to find it because it blended in too well with the other advertisements in the folder. So I think I did pretty good in that circumstance.